Thank you very much. After a brief recess, we will bring our meeting back to order. Standing Committee of Government Operations and the Standing Committee on Social Development on Bill 6. The last time we left, we just finished up on Section A of Bill 6. So we're on to Section B. Does committee agree to continue with Schedule B? There are 20 clauses in Schedule B. Committee?
Yeah.
Agreed. Agreed. Please go to Clause 1 as Schedule B on page 39 of the bill. Clause 1 through 8, Mr. McNeely.
Are we on page 14 of 18?
Yes,
I am, sir. Maybe just stick with this.
Yeah.
A lot more simple. Can you top of the page?
Oh, Mr. McNeely, yeah, wait. Perfect, thank you. Yes, Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I want to ask the minister a question about Section 7. This is where the minister may designate inspectors for the purpose of enforcement of this part of the bill, which is about smoking cannabis. So who are these inspectors going to be? Because, again, there's a lot of confusion in communities over whether it's going to be the RCMP enforcing this, the environmental health officers, of which we have very few, and/or municipal bylaw officers. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Minister Sebert.
If I may defer to the gentleman at the end of the table whose name I've unfortunately forgotten. Mr. Toft. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Minister Sebert. Mr. Toft.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the thoughtful question. The Department of Health and Social Services environmental health officers will be the primary enforcers of this piece of the legislation. Within territorial parks, it will be territorial officers who will enforce smoking prohibition in public places in those areas.
Thank you, Mr. Toft. Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that response. So just to be clear then, municipal governments are not going to be responsible for enforcing this part of the bill in any way, because we have this raised to us that if they are going to be asked to do that, they need more resources. So just to be very clear that municipal bylaw officials are not going to be held responsible for enforcing this aspect of the bill. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Toft?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that question of clarification. The bill does allow community government to have bylaw making authority to pass bylaws to expand on the prohibited areas that's set out by the territorial legislation. And in that case, should communities choose to do so, they would have the authority to enforce those bylaws within their own communities. Communities can also ask for the authority to enforce the territorial legislation should they so choose, but they are not required to do either. Back in January, I think it was January 24th and 25th, officials met with senior administrative officers from all communities across the territory over 2 teleconferences, and we walked them through these options that were available to them, again, should they so choose. And this was also raised again at the Northwest Territories Association of Communities annual general meeting earlier this year, and we offer those options out to communities. But again, the primary enforcers of this legislation will be the environmental health officers of the Department of Health and Social Services.
Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, look, I don't want to prolong this, so I'm going to ask a question of the minister. Can the minister put together then a briefing note for committee members on these discussions that have been held with municipal enforcement officials on this issue, so we understand what the options are, because they haven't been explained to us. But can we get a commitment out of the minister to provide that kind of a note to committee members before this bill is introduced in the House? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Mr. Sebert.
I think I can undertake to give my best efforts to do that. I don't know if we could get the material together that quickly. We'd probably provide you with something, so yes, I think we could do that.
Minister Sebert, could you be very clear if you're able to do it or not able to do it? Thank you. Minister Sebert.
I'll do it if I'm able. Yes, I'm told that we will be able to put something together. I know there has been correspondence from some associations of municipalities down south, and obviously there's been some conversation, so I will provide you the information that is provided to me, and so we will get something to you as soon as possible.
Thank you, Mr. Sebert. Any other questions or comments on this? Mr. Riley.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I appreciate that. I know we're all under the gun on this, and once again, I would urge the minister to clarify public communications around this again, because despite these meetings that were held, when we went and visited some of the same communities that probably had their SAOs at this meeting, they didn't know what was going on. So clearly, there's a need to improve communications with the public and with municipal governments on this matter. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. I'd take that more as a comment. The minister has made a commitment to get that information to committee as soon as possible. Any other comments, questions? Seeing none, back to clause 1 to 8. Mr. McNeely. Yes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Schedule B to Bill number 6 be amended by deleting subsection 8, brackets 3, and substituting the following. Brackets 3, an inspector may submit to an annulist for analyze or examination any sample taken by the inspector under paragraph brackets 2, bracket C, or produced by a person under paragraph brackets 2, brackets F. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McNeely. I have a seconder, Mr. Blake. Any questions, comments in regards to the motion?
Question.
Okay, the motion is in order. To the motion, question has been called. All those in favor? Opposed? The motion has been carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, we concur.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. Committee to clause 8 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. Clause 9 to 19. Agreed. Clause 20. Ms. Green.
Mr. Chair, I move that Schedule B to Bill 6 be amended by adding the following after paragraph 20 brackets B, brackets B.1, restricting or prohibiting the smoking of cannabis in areas that are adjacent to public places.
Thank you, Ms. Green. Seconder, Mr. Simpson. Any comments or questions in regards to this? Ms. Green.
I think this is a section that deals with the minister making regulations on where consumption can take place. And this provides some additional direction based on what we heard during our travels. There seemed to be quite a bit of concern about there being smoking of cannabis in public areas that may be frequented by anyone, but particularly by children. Thank you.
Green. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And we heard quite a bit about this, and the minister mentioned when he came before us on April 20th that they were considering regulations to prohibit smoking within a certain distance of school grounds and other public places. And I support this because this makes it clear that that the minister will have that authority. And it's not just around children, although that is what we heard primarily. Right now, the way the law is written, it allows for smoking cannabis in the streets, on sidewalks, in these public places, and people had a lot of concern about that, especially because there's nowhere to, there's no premises, licensed premises that, cannabis can be consumed. Essentially, it's just private residences and out in public. And so this will address that, or allow the minister to address that. There's also concern about smoking in front of stores, so I'd recommend that there be some prohibition against smoking within a certain distance of entrances to business and that type of thing. We heard everywhere that we should be keeping cannabis away from children. And so, I paced it out in my driveway, and the 30 meters that the minister mentioned isn't that far. You can clearly see that someone will have a joint in their mouth, and you can smell the smoke from there. And so, we've got to put a lot of thought into where exactly this is allowed. So I just want to flag that for the minister. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Simpson. Any other comments? Ms. Green?
I'll just add to what Mr. Simpson said, that we went through a real evolution of wondering whether we should prescribe certain distances from different kinds of public institutions, such as schools and stores and so on. And we decided that in the end that was unworkable, especially in the smaller communities where you may have things closer together and there's nothing you can do about it. So this is an area where we are encouraging you to use your discretion to ensure that that it's not smoked widely in public. Thank you.
Motion's in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All opposed? Motion passed. Does the minister concur with the amendment?
I can say that we had some of the similar conversations that have been mentioned, and the unworkability of having a certain number of meters from where cannabis could be smoked, and therefore we concur with this.
Okay, thank you, Minister Sebert. Committee, do you agree to Clause 20 Clause 20 as amended? Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. Committee, just a little bit of process here. I just need to go back to the very beginning. It says clause, do we agree to clause 1 through 7? It's just the process. We agree. Okay, thank you. No, I said 1 through 8. Sorry. So we just got to clarify. Okay, thank you. So, okay, this committee, that concludes section, Schedule B of the Bill 6. Does committee agree that consideration Schedule B is completed? Agreed. Thank you. Does committee agree with the continuing with Schedule C? There are 19 clauses in Schedule C. Agreed. Thank you. Clauses 1 through 5. Agreed. Clauses 6 through 10.
Agreed.
Clauses 11 and 12.
Agreed.
Clause 13, Mr. McNeely.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Schedule C to Bill 6 be amended by deleting paragraph 13, brackets 3, brackets A, and substituting the following, brackets A, subsections 116.14, brackets 2, comma, brackets 4, and brackets 5. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. McNeely, have a seconder? Mr. Blake. Thank you, Mr. Blake. Any questions or comments to this? Seeing no comments or questions, the motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Concur.
Thank you, Mr. Sebert. Committee to Clause 13 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. Clause 14 through 19. Does committee agree? Agreed. Thank you. This concludes Section C of Bill 6. Does committee agree that consideration of schedules, sorry, we'll try this again. This concludes Schedule C of Bill 6. Does committee agree that consideration of Schedule C is completed?
Agreed.
Thank you. We now return to page 1 of Bill 6. Clause 1. We're at the very page 1 of the bill, Bill 6. Okay. Clause 1. Does it need to be amended? There's an amendment to it.
We did two amendments here already. We defined, consumed.
Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that subclause 1 brackets 4 of Bill 6 be deleted and the following substituted. Brackets 4, the following provisions set out in Schedule A come into force on the day on which this act receives assent. Brackets A, subsection 1, brackets 1, brackets B, section 6, brackets C, part 4, brackets D, section 71, 72, and 74. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Seconder? Okay. Questions, comments? Seeing none. Motion in order. Question?
Actually,
Oh, Mr. Testart.
yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, and just for anyone who's following our process and interested in what this represents, legalization, of course, the effects of these laws won't come into reality until cannabis is legalized by the federal government. So many sections of this bill will wait until legalization day. However, these sections will be brought forward the day the act receives assent, which will be at the end of this sitting of the Legislative Assembly, which means areas relevant to plebiscites and allowing communities the ability to permit or restrict or ban cannabis in their communities will be made available to them, and the committee and the government both feel strongly that this is something that will ultimately give more discussion and options to communities so they are not rushed into making any decisions by legalization date. So it's an important amendment, and I'm glad we are moving forward on it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Testart. Any other comments? Okay, okay. Motion's in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Does the minister concur?
Yes, we concur.
Okay, thank you. The minister concurs with this amendment. Thank you, Minister Sebert. Committee to clause 1 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. Clause 2.
Agreed.
Clause 3, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 6 be amended by adding the following after Clause 3. 4, brackets 1, within 1 year after the convening of the first session of the 19th Assembly of the Legislative Assembly of the Northwest Territories, the Legislative Assembly or a committee designated or established by the Legislative Assembly shall commence a review of the provisions and operation of the provisions of this act that constitute the Cannabis Products Act and the Cannabis Smoking Control Act, and that amend the Motor Vehicles Act. 4, brackets 2, the review shall be completed as soon as is reasonably practicable and shall include an examination of the implementation, administration, and effectiveness of the provisions referred to in subsection 1. Brackets 3, the responsible minister in any department or agency involved in the implementation and administration of the provisions referred to in subsection 1 shall provide all reasonable assistance to the Legislative Assembly or any committee referred to in subsection 1. Brackets 4, on the completion of the review or report, including any recommendations for amendments to the provisions referred to in subsection 1 shall be submitted to the Speaker. Brackets 5, the Speaker shall cause the report to be laid before the Legislative Assembly as soon as is reasonably practicable. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
O'Reilly. Do I have a seconder? Mr. Simpson. Any questions, comments? Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yes, this motion is with regard to establishing a mandatory review of the implementation of this legislation and administration of it, and that will take place in the next assembly. So after about, I guess, 2 or 3 years of operation, this will require that mandatory review to be carried out by the next assembly. We heard this concern from at least 2 of the communities that we visited with the Northern Group. It was raised to us in Batchako, and it was raised to us in Tuktoyaktuk. So I think this is a good idea, and will allow us to, we're not going to get everything right. We're not going to get everything right off the bat, but this will cause us to have a pause, look at how it's rolling out, and make a report that will be public and will engage and involve the public, and look at how we can improve this as it's rolled out over the first few years of implementation. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Riley. Any other comments? Okay, the motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes, we concur.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. Committee to clause 3 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. Does committee agree that Bill 6, Cannabis Legalization and Regulation Implementation Act is now ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole as amended?
Agreed.
Okay. Mr. Tester.
I move, Mr. Chair, I move that Bill 6 Cannabis Legalization and Regulation Implementation Act as amended and reprinted be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Tester. Can I have a seconder? Moved by Mr. Bolio. Any questions? Comments? Seeing none. Motion is in order. Motion is on the floor. To the motion. Question is called. All those in favor? All opposed? Thank you. The motion is carried. Bill 6, Cannabis Legalization and Regulation Implementation Act will be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole as amended and reprinted. Thank you, Minister Sebert. Thank you to your officials. Thanks to everybody for coming out this afternoon. Do you have any closing comments, Minister Sebert, before we adjourn?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to thank you all for the large amount of work which has been put into this. We've been under a lot of time pressure on this, as I know you have too. And again, thanks for your interesting questions and submissions, all of which we have treated very seriously. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Sebert. At this point, we'll adjourn the meeting and I'll ask committee to wait after the public and the minister leaves, and we can do a brief wrap-up. Thank you.